Hello guys, I hope you are well. I'm sorry I've been absent a bit from modelling over the last week or so. I went on holiday a couple of weeks ago and therefore didn't have much time at the bench, but I do have a video for you today, and that is this quick build of the Airfix Vintage Classics CA-13 Boomerang. This is actually the first Airfix Vintage Classics kit that I've ever built. I know some people really love this range, they love the nostalgia value of these classic kits. I know other people can take them or leave them. I think one thing we can agree on though is that it's good that Airfix very clearly label these old kits now, rather than taking old kits, putting them in a new box and selling them as if they were new toolings, which can certainly fool the inexperienced buyer, and it's a technique that some companies still do use. The Boomerang is not a particularly well-known aircraft, so let's look a little bit at its history before we move on to the kit. It's an Australian designed aircraft made by the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, and it has its roots in the mid to late 1930s when Australia realised that war was on the horizon and it needed to equip itself with aircraft. By the time of the Japanese attacks in the Pacific in late 1941, Australia was in desperate need for fighter aircraft. England, of course, had been fighting Nazi Germany alone since 1940, and its aircraft industry was struggling to meet demand, while the US industry was upping their output but focusing on the US Air Force and Navy, having just been drawn into World War II. And of course, even if the aircraft were available, shipping aircraft from England or the US in wartime was something that was fraught with difficulties. So with that in mind, in December 1941, the Australian government gave authorisation to develop the CA-12 Boomerang, which was based on the wing, tail and centre sections of the existing Railway, which was an Australian-built fighter. By June 1943, production of 105 of these initial boomerangs was complete. By this time there was less pressure on Australia as US Air Force units and US supplied aircraft were more readily available, but nevertheless developments of the Boomerang continued. These were named the CA-13, CA-14, CA-14A and CA-19, and they were built until the end of the war in 1945. In total, 250 boomerangs were built across all versions. Looking at the kit and that rather jaunty angle that I filmed the box at, we've got the standard Airfix Vintage Classics branding there with the classic original artwork, and making it very clear that it is an old kit. On the top side of the box we can see that we have two colour schemes in this box, both very similar, the dark green and the dark earth, one with the white tail section and one without. I'll talk more about the colour schemes in a moment. Looking inside the box, we've got a very small number of parts, as we might expect for a vintage kit like this. I didn't mention this earlier, but originally this kit is a 1965 tooling. So inside the bag we have the standard older style of sprues here, which is the sort of central sprue piece with the parts coming off the edge. I quite like this style actually. We've got the wings there with the raised rivet detail, and the same thing there on the fuselage halves, simple pilot figure and seat, and then the other fuselage half, the rear elevator, some wheels and some guns, and the lower half there of the wings. Surprisingly clean pieces actually, given their age, not a great deal of flash or anything like that, but as I said, quite a low parts count. Now the instructions in these vintage classics are redone to modern sort of style, and I believe the instructions themselves have been updated just to reflect the modern style of instructions there with the numbering and everything. As you can see, it's a very simple build with only 8 steps. No real cockpit detail, simply a seat and a pilot. 2 fuselage halves go together. The engine goes on the front. The wings go together and go on the bottom. And then we have a small number of pieces like the wheels and the cannons to add. We do have a surprisingly large amount of stencil data, however, given both the scale, 1/72nd scale, and the age of the kit. I'm imagining this must have been added since the original release. We also have the newly done in the new Airfix style colour schemes. So we've got the first one here, number 4 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, New Guinea, February 1944. This is in the dark brown and dark green, which looks similar to the RAAF colours. However, the Royal Australian Air Force used their own versions of these colours, foliage green and dark earth. So when I paint this, I am going to use a variation of the standard colours, so it does stand out from the British versions. We've got the quite distinctive white markings there on the tail and the elevators. And although it doesn't show it here on the instructions, it appears more sort of sky grey colour. My understanding is that the underside should be a sky blue colour. The other thing to note, of course, is that we have the standard roundels which we use in the Pacific Theatre, which don't have the red dot in the middle to avoid any confusion with Japanese markings. There is a small note here on the right hand side of the instructions which talks about that brown area at the top of the tail. If you notice on the box art, that's blue, and it just basically says that the original box art was painted that way, it was blue, but we now believe that that was a misinterpretation of a black and white photo by the artist. So to keep things the way they were, they've left the box art blue, but it should now be a brown colour. There is another paint scheme included as well, although I forgot to film it for some reason. That is essentially the same paint scheme as this one, except it doesn't have the white tail markings, instead it has the standard red, white and blue fin flash. And that is the Royal Australian Air Force, number 5 Squadron, 1944. Here we can see the decals, and I told you a lie there, didn't I? It's not a red, white and blue fin flash, it's just a blue and white fin flash on that second scheme. As we could see from the callouts, there's a significant number of stencils here, and then it's simply the code letters and the roundels. In these Vintage Classics kits, the decals are of course newly printed, so they're not from 1967 or 5 or anything like that, so they should all go down very well. Moving on to the build, we get literally no cockpit interior, simply a couple of pegs there for us to attach the pilot seat, which again has no cushion detail, seatbelts, anything like that. You could add that detail if you wanted to. I decided just to build this as a nice quick build straight out of the box and have a bit of fun with it. It was quite tricky to get this seat into place, and you'll see here I've pushed it right up against the side of the cockpit, which is a bit of a mistake, as you'll see in a moment. To keep it in place, I like to attach the other cockpit side just temporarily. And it's a good job I did that, because as I did that I noticed, as you can see here, that seat is no longer in the centre. So I took the seat and repositioned it to be much more central, like so, with a bit of fiddling. We do get this pilot figure. I decided not to use him. He doesn't look too keen to be in an aircraft. He sort of standing at rigid attention there. So we'll leave that seat empty. While the glue on that was drying, I took to building the engine, which is a simple 3-piece construction. A larger circular piece with a pin to go through it to hold the propeller, followed by a smaller circular piece in front, keyed so they fit nicely together. Our engine cowl will go over the front of that, which of course means we need to paint the inside of the cowl before we put these parts together. And the propeller attaches like so. Moving on again, it was time to attach the upper wings to the lower wing. And again, on both those pieces we can see there is a reasonable amount of detail. None of it is recessed, it's all raised, but there's a fairly decent effort there at the rivets and so on. And the top wings do line up reasonably well with the lower wings. Then of course, once it's all glued together, the fuselage will go into place. We have this bulge at the bottom, which I'm not sure the purpose of, to be honest. I'm not sure if it's a fuel tank or something else. but that adds a little bit of bracing too to that lower wing piece. Probably the smallest parts in the kit are the undercarriage legs. They slot into the wheels, and then the undercarriage doors fit well onto those, like so. So those pieces of course will all need to be painted separately. Here's our seat with the glue dried. We can see the second half of the fuselage fits well there, and that seat is central. But of course, before I can glue the two halves together, I do need to paint the inside of them with an interior green colour. Also, because we can see down through the cockpit to the top of that wing piece, we will need to make sure that we paint the top of that wing piece in the interior green and the bottom of the fuselage piece in interior green, because that forms the top of the wheel wells. So here we are with those pieces painted. I used Tamiya XF71, which is the interior green. I know that the Australian Air Force didn't use the same interior green colour as the RAAF, but I did in this model, is all I can say. There we go, with everything painted green, we should be able to just dry fit things together and see that indeed the cockpit floor is now the correct green colour, as are the wheel wells. The engine pieces were glued together and painted in a dark black colour. This is actually XF69 NATO black. Then they were given a very heavy dry brush of one of the Vallejo metal colours. This is dark aluminium. With the fuselage halves glued together, I just noticed this small keyhole shape hole in the bottom of the fuselage. I'm guessing that was for a stand, though one wasn't included in the kit. I don't know why I didn't notice that earlier, but I decided to fill it in by backing it with a piece of styrene and then putting some filler into the hole. Some sanding was definitely required on the seam lines, both in front of the cockpit and behind it down the spine of the aircraft. It wasn't really anything that didn't fit, it was just a case of quite a prominent meeting point between the two halves. There we go, that looks a bit better after some sanding. The aircraft taking shape very clearly now. Still a bit more sanding to go in a few areas. And for some reason, this hole here in the side of the fuselage, which I didn't notice earlier, just seems to have appeared. So that's another one to fill in, along with that keyhole at the bottom of the fuselage I mentioned earlier. And again, that underside all needs sanding as well. With the basic construction complete, it was time to give the entire model a coat of primer. In most cases I've stopped using modelling primer, instead I'm using Halford's car primer because it's quite a lot cheaper. So the Boomerang was given a good coat of that, and then it was time to move on to the painting. As I said, I wanted to use the Australian colours, which are the earth brown and the foliage green. I know that some companies such as Life Colour do produce sets of Australian colours, but I wanted to really avoid buying any more paints if I could. I've got plenty of paints. So I mixed my own. For the earth brown I used XF64 with a tiny amount of black to darken it slightly. For the foliage green I used XF5, which is flat green, with a couple of drops of XF11, which is Japanese navy green. Both of these were measured with a standard eyeball, so I couldn't tell you any exact ratios. However, this is what the aircraft looked like painted entirely in the earth brown. At this scale I don't bother trying to pick out just the individual parts that will be brown. I painted the whole aircraft in brown, and then I'd go over the top with the green later. In order to do that, rather than using masking tape, I prefer to use masking sheets. I find that much easier because you can draw the pattern on the sheet, cut it out to shape, and then just lay the sheet onto the model. In fact, as it happened here, I noticed that the model is the exact same size as the paint scheme representation. So that meant I could use a bit of a trick to get me started. So to do this, I put the instructions inside a clear plastic bag. Then I took a section of the masking sheet, removed it from the backing, and stuck it onto the plastic bag over the top of the instructions. And as you can see, I can now see through that sheet to the instructions below, and I can simply trace the camouflage pattern onto the masking sheet. To be honest, a pencil is not the best tool for this job, and I switched to a pen shortly after filming this. But this just gives you a handy starting point to get all those small changes in direction, and you end up with something like this. And then I remove the masking sheet from the plastic bag and put it back onto the original backing paper. Then I just cut the pieces out. Now when I get to the edge of the wing, rather than following the edge contour, I simply cut straight out to the edge of the masking tape. And the reason for that, of course, is I want a bit of excess to wrap around the edge of the wing. You just got to remember here to keep the right piece, so I want the pieces, of course, which will cover up the brown, since I'm painting the green next. There we go. So although that doesn't look like it, we can position that piece of masking sheet over the wing, and that should give us the areas that should be green. And you can see that corresponds quite well to the area on the model. Of course, we had to improvise a little bit under the roundel because we can't see where the brown and green go. Then we can cut out the next piece and build up the mask. Now for some reason I thought I'd filmed this masked but not painted, but I didn't, so we'll have to skip forward now to me having done the green painting. So you can see here how I made the individual pieces of the mask there from the plans. The side pieces were a bit more difficult, I did have to sort of freehand those a bit, but the wings were copied basically directly from the plans. And if we peel that away, we get a nice, quite detailed demarcation line. I feel like this is a better system than using the blue tack sausages because you tend to get the sort of the small details on those lines that are important in this scale, but that you can easily lose on those blue tack sausages. And there you go, there is my foliage green and dark earth. Now of course the final part is the underside, which is sky blue. To paint the sky blue I took XF19 Sky Grey and added a couple of drops, not too many at all because it's a really strong colour, of XF8 blue. Maybe in this mix I should have added a bit more. It looked a bit bluer in my mixing palette than it did on the actual model, but nevertheless I'm quite happy with the final result there. Here you can see the completed paint scheme once I've given it a coat of TS13 gloss in preparation for the decals. There are only a few markings and insignia decals on the sheet, but there are a lot of stencils. Surprisingly many considering it's an old kit and it's 1/72nd scale. You can see on the instructions here there are loads of them. I don't know if these were included on the original kit or if they've been added since. I was a bit worried because a lot of these stencils go down in areas where there's that raised detail, and because the decals are so small I was worried that they wouldn't go down properly. However, they stuck to this gloss surface really well and just needed a small amount of Tamiya mark fit. Here we are with all the decals in place. The landing gear were painted and fitted, with the bay covers on the main landing gear being quite awkward. I had to cut those down a few millimeters to make them fit. I didn't want to do too much weathering on this, but I thought I would use this black panel line wash by Ammo. Of course there aren't many panel lines on this because a lot of the detail is raised, so I applied it more as an overall wash, making sure that when I removed it with some odourless thinner I was always streaking it in the direction of airflow. And the idea here was to provide a bit of grime and dirt just to break up the overall surface of the aircraft. I started with the white horizontal stabilisers, which looked quite stark at first but could be thinned and removed until I got just a slightly off-white streaking appearance. I should say at this point that after the decals I gave everything a coat of VMS matte varnish, which is why it's nowhere near as glossy as it was before. I tried to highlight some of that raised detail by putting the black panel line wash around it before streaking it back. Near the engine I went a bit thicker with the panel line wash, stippling it on and not really streaking it back or removing it. Similarly with the underside, although I had to be a bit more careful here because of course it is a much lighter colour, but always the same process, adding some to the raised detail and streaking back with odourless thinner in the direction of the airflow. Once I was happy with that and I had painted and added the cockpit glass, I considered the model to be complete. So there we go guys, that was my build of the Airfix Vintage Classics Commonwealth CA-13 Boomerang in 1/72 scale. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I really did enjoy building this kit. It's quite nice to do a simple kit sometimes like this, and quite nice to have a small scale as well. I don't normally build 1/72 scale, but occasionally I do like to. I'd like to know what you think about this kit and about Vintage Classics kits in general. Are they classic kits which are worth the money, or is it just companies trying to cash in on their old toolings? Let me know in the comments below. And before I go, I would like to say a huge thank you to all of you for watching. And of course, special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members who give me such great encouragement and support on an ongoing basis. It's really appreciated guys, so thank you very much. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that I finally got the paint down on my Airfix 1/24 scale Spitfire. And I've got a range of exciting builds coming up in the near future too, so if you'd like to see those, then please remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.